everyone. We're very happy to have you here. So this is the first webinar in a three-part series entitled Shaping Provisioning Systems for Social Ecological Transformation. We're very happy you could all join us. I'm very happy to have our speakers, who I will introduce in a moment, but first I'll give you a little bit of context for the webinar series. It's based on a special issue of the same name, Shaping Provisioning Systems for Social Ecological Transformation, that will be out in Sustainability, Science, Practice and Policy next year. So the webinar series are based on content that the different articles within the special issue address. And our three speakers here this evening are all authors for the special issue as well. We've been in an authors workshop for the last 2 days, and it's been really nice to have them, very productive. So this webinar is organized by the International Polanyi Society with support from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And the title for our webinar today is A Match Made in Heaven, Synergies Between Ecological and Social Provisioning Outcomes. So we're hoping to dig into the relationship between economic necessities and social goals, focusing on how we can approach the two synergistically, and considering the debates on positive and negative repercussions between strategies aimed at living within planetary boundaries and achieving human flourishing, and how this framework of provisioning systems can help us understand these relationships. And then I think we'll drop a link in the chat for the future webinars as well, which will take place later this month and then early November. So I will get to introducing our speakers. I'll introduce first Halliki Kreinin, who you can see on the right side of the other screen. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Münster, currently working on the EU 1.5 Lifestyles project, which is funded by the EU. Her research focuses on the social ecological transformation of work, just transition, and environmental labor studies, including the connection between narratives praising work and overconsumption as good life narratives, and these as barriers to transformation. Halliki is also a founding member of the Degrowth Vienna Society. We have also with us Katharina Bohnenberger, who is a research associate at the Institute for Socioeconomics at the University of Duisburg-Essen. She's worked in scientific policy at the Luca Institute for Climate, Environment and Energy. I'm the German Advisory Council. Yes, you have to unmute your. Apologies for the feedback. And for the German Advisory Council on Global Change. Her current research deals with the integration of environmental and social policy and the development of a sustainable welfare state, which we'll hear more about shortly. And then last but certainly not least, we have Luca Calafati, who's a social researcher working on ecological and social transition at the intersection of analysis, policy, and activism. Luca has a PhD in urban studies from the University of Milano Bicocca and currently works with the Foundational Economy Collective, where he focuses on place-based research with particular attention to ecology and community activism. So we're very happy to have all three of them here with us this evening. The plan for the webinar is that each speaker will begin with an input around 5 to 10 minutes, giving us their take on the topic generally. And then I will moderate a Q&A with the speakers and amongst the speakers, and then we will go to audience questions for Q&A. For audience questions, you are welcome to raise your hand if you would like to concisely ask the question yourself. You're also welcome to enter it into the chat if you would rather have us read the question out for you. So as you like. Yeah, excellent. And with that, I would pass to Halliki to begin.
Okay, so in our paper, we try to bring together this framework of the provisioning systems, with first of all a kind of review of how agency and structure come together. We focus on different barriers and enablers of sustainable living, and we first of all try to problematize actually how much agency we have in bringing about change. So the provisioning systems approach, maybe we should start with that actually. We should all explain what we mean by provisioning systems, because it might be that we mean different things. So we view provisioning systems as kind of separate systems through which society or through which society provides for specific needs such as mobility, housing, nutrition, and also leisure in our project. And we try to problematize how much agency we have as individuals in living sustainably. And we come to the conclusion that it's not a lot, but it's a little bit. And then we do a kind of study of the main structural barriers and enablers, as I said, which are in the way of allowing people to make sustainable choices with how much agency they have, and which also inhibit or allow us to have sustainable provisioning systems. If that makes sense now. Okay, maybe you could also share the slide. The slide, yeah. So in our research, we talked to 36 experts in 5 European countries and discussed different structural and enablers and barriers of sustainable ways of living. And we find out that there's kind of actually a lot of agreement between different experts. So this is climate scientists, also policymakers, people working in the NGOs and so on. There's a lot of agreement actually on what are these big barriers to the transformation and to sustainable ways of living. And in our research then we also try to divide the key structural or discrete structures into deep and shallow enablers and barriers respectively. I think you can see that on the screen now. It's a kind of graphic explanation. So one of the very key barriers, I think 23 out of 36 experts consider it the most important structural barrier, is the economic growth paradigm itself, that you can see on the left-hand side. And we suggest that these deeper barriers are very difficult to change without wider transformations in power relations, whereas some of the more shallow barriers might be easier to change. And we suggest that actually we need transformation in both. And our paper is not finished yet, so we're still kind of working on it at the moment. But we also have a discussion with the experts then on how to overcome some of these structural barriers. And and as I said, it's kind of a work in progress still, so hopefully we will have some earth-shattering outcomes that will help us transform everything. I hope this is okay. This is a little sort of snapshot of what we've been working on.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. And also thank you for the explanation of what you mean by provisioning systems.
Yes,
in this context.
yeah.
And then Katharina, I will pass to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for being here. It has been a really nice event, really inspiring. And I'm happy that we're having an online event today, so people also from abroad can take place. And I would like to make 3 points actually. So the first one is really what do we understand by provisioning systems? And as you said in the introduction, Colleen, and as you mentioned now, Halliki, the linking between planetary boundaries and human well-being is really crucial for that. The kind of mechanisms that we have installed in society that connect the two things are very, very much this what I understand as a crucial thing of provisioning systems. And the welfare state, in my perspective, is like really important in that process because it really shapes our everyday lives, how we work, how we consume, how we live, and so on. So the welfare state has a particular role in that. And I think it's been only lately that we realized how important the welfare state is. So in the past, we've really seen, like, for example, the climate crisis as a technological crisis, or maybe as an economic crisis where we need economic and technical solutions for it. But now, I think since the latest IPCC report, it's kind of obvious that we really need societal transformation in order to really like get the climate crisis and also other ecological crises into like the right place and like avoid these crises. And on the other hand, also the welfare state is very much needed in order to deal with the new risks. So we have had like social risks of the past, like unemployment and so on, and like elderly care and so on. But now we're really facing new climate risks that are even much harsher than what we've seen in the past. So the welfare state has a very particular role in like provisioning system, both in order to like meet ecological goals, but also in order to like ensure human well-being. And if you'd like to share the slide, I think we can there, if we come more into practice, so what can we do? How are provisioning systems like being implemented? It's one approach is eco-social policies that can help us realign and like transform provisioning systems, make them more ecologically sound. And when we look at that research that is out there on the topic, and I try to do meta study on the research that is out there, we can actually distinguish 3 types of approaches. So the first is actually to say, what are the social outcomes of environmental policies, for example, carbon pricing and so on. So what are the distributional consequences of that? I think that's quite well studied, although we actually know very little still about some things, particularly the provisioning of institutional things, so public services, universal basic services, and so on. And then there's the other side. So what are actually the ecological outcomes of social policies? And there we have actually very little research about it. I think it's much under researched so far. And when we integrate the 2 things together, we really try to come up with a new also vision of what could be a welfare vision in the 21st century. Then we come up with this idea of the sustainable welfare state. And that is something that I would like to explore more in the paper that we're writing. And I think one really key aspect of that is that sustainable welfare must be growth independent.
Okay, thank you very much. And then Luca, please.
Okay, yes. Good evening, everybody. So I was very much inspired by the title of this webinar. So instead of talking about the paper that I presented during this event, I'm gonna share some points which relate to the title and come also from the great discussion we've had over this couple of days. Doesn't happen very often that you have such events. It's great. So a couple of points really. The first one regards the relation between social and environmental policy, where I feel like there is a mainstream understanding where the idea is that you have a trade-off between social and environmental policies, in the sense that if you want better social policy and increase the welfare of people, you need more resources, and hence you will place a bigger burden on the planet. At the same time, if you want to do environmental policies which decrease the burden that we put on our planet, this leads to use less resources, and then we have then less resources to do the social policy. So I think this is actually a fundamentally wrong vision of the relation between social and environmental policies. I think one that I actually had for some time, but over time, I started to think that if we all, and I think there are so many examples, and many actually come from the colleagues I've met these days and from their contribution, I think there are so many examples that show that actually, if you think a bit outside the box, there are very interesting way to do both. So really there is maybe a match made in heaven here. And Colleen, would you mind to share?
Mhm.
And also, could I look at your screen?
Yes, certainly.
So this is just a bit to illustrate this point that social and environmental policy can go hand in hand. And I know it may sound a bit naive and it's also a bit idealistic, but this is a bit to open up our imaginaries and think a bit. So let us, I'll go through this diagram pretty quickly. So if we start from this idea that many have, that we can and should have some sort of wealth redistribution, together with elimination of what many have called the bullshit jobs, or what others have called during this conference like excess job, we see that actually the idea that some others have in this field that propose of a shorter working week with livable wages is actually something that could be possible, at least in theory. And a shorter working week with more livable wages would enable that many people, not only few, but the majority of people finally have the time and resources to engage in lots of good stuff like creative activities, engaging in politics, developing their mind and bodies, also very banal, doing sport, and also do more care work in the household and in the community. And there's a lot of literature that emphasized how this would lead to more fulfilled and healthier people. And in a more, let's say, sane and healthy society, my argument is that we don't need then so much welfare provision because the society is healthy. So we could place less pressure on the welfare state, and we could also start to think how to decouple welfare state from growth. And at the same time, there's a lot of research that shows how people that have the time to engage in creative activities, people who have the time who do sports and do care work, they don't need much consumption, because there's a big argument that is quite solid also scientifically that a lot of work is very much related to our need to consume, to consumerism, basically. So, and a society in which people work less and have more time for themselves and for society and for the goods would also consume less resources, and this would again put a much lesser pressure on the environment, because we all know that the main reason why we are fucking up this planet is that we consume way too much. This is of course related to the Western world, and it's a diagram that works for high-income countries, but it works for lower-income countries. But it's just to illustrate that I think there are many options to reconcile environmental and social policies.
Yeah, great, thanks. And Luca, you were actually, so it's nice that you brought in the role of work and working time reduction. This is something that Halliki has done quite some work on herself and also Katharina.
Yeah.
So I think this is a good point actually to then ask if you would like to respond to these ideas that Luca just brought up.
Yeah, do you want to go first? Yeah, okay. I would actually be controversial and say that there is somewhat, it really depends how you define social policy, in my opinion, as to whether there is synergy or kind of opposition, because well, we come back to the welfare state question. So historically, social improvements in Western Europe at least have happened in line with economic growth, the post-war era. And in the UK, for example, you had universal healthcare being rolled out, many other social policies, which were enabled by a sort of growing welfare state and economic growth, which were enabled by full-time employment, strong labor unions, economic growth. So there was a kind of, as Alan Schneider says, a kind of this growth coalition. And of course, we would say to that, coming from the degrowth side, we would say, well, it's more to do with the social policies than economic growth itself. Obviously, that's true. In a way, economic growth was also hiding inequality, and in a way, economic growth allowed for societies not to deal with inequality. This Katharina, I'm sure we'll talk more about. I don't want to take anything away from you, but I think it's also a little bit naive just to say that there is complete synergy, because it really depends on a provisioning system as to whether and how social welfare is provided. I mean, because from Andreas Nomi's paper, we had this discussion about social housing in Vienna, right? And again, we would all agree social housing is great and it's a good thing, but at the same time, currently, building more sort of large cement houses, taking away more sort of green space, or even land use changes to build social housing in Vienna is also environmentally harmful. So I think we also maybe need to problematize this kind of relationship a bit more, but certainly it doesn't. There can be synergies between both, and in the long term, of course, there are, in a sense, you don't have social policy without climate policy in the long term. But I think it's important for us also to kind of question it and to look behind, the curtains a bit.
Yeah, which I think is what we're trying to do with the provisioning system lens.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe, but I would like to add on that, because I think you both combine very important perspective. What we can maybe agree on is that in the past, we actually see that the welfare state has very much been depending on like the material increase and overconsumption, like in the Western countries at least. But maybe the future is like has a different role for the welfare state. So I think I would actually see that there are different kind of needs that the welfare state should like deal with. So first of all, we do have like the material needs, and it's actually the case that after the Second World War, for example, there was like really a material shortage. So people were suffering from material needs, and it was a good thing that the welfare state like kept on like producing more and providing people with more material needs. But obviously there's a certain kind of limit to it, what is actually needed. Now we have like the other problem that people have too much stuff and they don't know how to get rid of their old stuff, while at the same time we do have distributional problems, particularly if you look at the global scale. But there are also other human needs. So for example, I think the human need for social interaction, for participation, and that really requires also some spare time. And I think the point that Luca made is that if people do have the time for social interaction, then this can also be a very important sphere of social identity. And I think it's really a funny thing that we engage in all this like employment and work and then all the time, but we have no mandate over that. So we don't decide, like some of us who are really privileged decide what to do in that job, but most people can't decide. And so most of the time they're actually not autonomous to decide what to do in that time. And maybe that's like a new perspective that might come in, and that is very much also linked to how the question of time poverty and resource poverty interact.
Yeah, great, thank you. Do you see movement towards, they use this term eco-social policies, right? So policies that are intentionally addressing both the ecological and the social. Like, would you see perhaps some of the narratives around the Green New Deal that were put forward, or some of the narratives that have come out of the COVID pandemic as taking up this framing? Do you think there's movement in this direction? And maybe you want to talk about this generally or about specific systems of provision as you like, but I'd be curious to hear your
Okay.
Do you want me to go first?
As
Yeah,
you
I can. Yeah, yes, as you want. I mean, first of all, a small clarification. What I said before, like, thank you for the additional comments. I agree. I mean, that was also a bit of a provocation, but it's important because we've been discussing a lot about what blockages exist for transition. And I know that it's not easy to reconcile social and ecological policies completely. And we have been discussing a lot about these 2 days about, all the institutional skills and capabilities, blockages that we have that makes it harder bring about this future that we all want. But, and I entirely agree, it's not easy, but at the same time, I also think we need to change a bit the narrative around transition. Because until now, I feel that much of this narrative is quite negative. It's within this idea that if we want to make the world greener, we have to renounce, we have to give up a lot of good things. So it's going to be a bleak world, a world with less resources, more struggle, etc., etc. And this is not palatable to us and to a lot of people around us. And I think that without denying the clear difficulties that are around transition, I think this is also important that we start to share and give people glimpses of the future which are actually attractive. And at the same time, I see as part of this process also emphasizing, and so I come to your question, the many things that already happened. Because I've been in this game for not so long, but over the last 5-6 years, and I started researching and being part of this alternative economy movement, is that all across the world, global north, global south, east, west, doesn't matter, you have so many people working on these topics. With lots of interesting projects, some of them have failed, some not, but to start to find a quality amongst this project and a power behind that, I think we should all be proud of and should be, I think, brought in the front to say, well, there's a lot of going on and some of these things really fly and they're very good and they're not that difficult to actually bring about. Yeah.
Maybe I would like to contradict it a little bit. I mean, not so much contradiction, but I think it's really, actually, I think social policies and environmental policies are really like the same, like, are two sides of the same coin. So I think it's often that in public it's like said that there's a trade-off between that, but to me, the longer I do research on that, the more I have the perception that it's actually like a climate delaying strategy that is very like intentionally being spread, because if you look at the literature, we don't really find support for that. Obviously, we do have cases in which we have problematic distributional consequences of that, of things, but this we do also with other stuff. So there's no systematic that climate policies, for example, are particularly bad for social outcomes. But what I think it does question is the kind of distributional thing. So it does raise distributional questions. And for example, the welfare state has in the past really also been a tool for keeping power relations and distributional things as they are. So not re-questioning them. Now the question is really how I think successful climate environmental policy would definitely question that and also do something on the distributional side. And if this is then considered still a social policy, is also a question of normative background. So what kind of distribution do we want in society? And obviously, if we want the unequal society as we have it now, then we probably say that, well, climate policies are a problem because they are redistributing stuff. But if we have a more egalitarian perspective on that, I think there are really two sides of the same coin.
But that's why I said, right, that it's important how you even phrase social policy, because it is used in many different ways by different actors. But I would also obviously agree with you and fight for eco-social policies, but maybe so you can have social policies that are eco-social and are good for the environment, but you can also imagine social policies that are not, right?
Yeah.
Maybe this is actually some time to bring in role of the current energy crisis and the policy responses we are seeing to this, right? And I'll leave this very, very open now, but I would be very curious to hear your thoughts on how this is being dealt with, if you see what you see as positive and negative, and how, if there is open discourse around the relationship between the social and the ecological in terms of how the energy crisis is being addressed or even talked about being addressed. Whoever would like to go first.
So, I mean, I do have a strong opinion on that. So I think the crisis is super interesting. I mean, I think it's really, it really shows a lot about society. So, for example, we actually learned that how the fossil dependency is actually really a social risk. This has, like, in the past, it has been an ecological risk, but now it really becomes a social risk. And that becomes very obvious, I think. And there are two things that I think we can really learn from that. So first of all, we now just like experiencing like new distributional mechanisms. So we really see that the current way of like distributing resources, money, and so on in society hasn't really worked well, and that it is not really crisis safe. So so for example, the current inflation, like all the welfare benefits that cannot be adapted like fast enough to that. States don't have a register for their people to send them money. I mean, that's like ridiculous. And like, if you think about it, what kind of digitalization we have, but we are not capable of sending money to our inhabitants. That's like
Germany.
That's Germany, yes.
Austria is doing.
There are some countries who are doing, who actually manage to do that, and some who pretend that they're not able to do that. But what we're really experiencing now is like new ways of distributing. And I think that's something really innovative, and that's out of the box than what has been like the existing canon of how we can deal with that. And I think the other thing what we really learn from is that if we want, we really can. So we have all that kind of money that is now available for solving that crisis, and that's something we already saw during the corona, that also if we wanted, we can really do stuff. The question now is for me, can we have the same want of changing stuff also in the climate crisis and all the other ecological crises, or how do we get momentum for that?
Yeah. Do you want to go?
No.
No, I would just add that we discussed this earlier as well. So the gas crisis it's kind of really a perfect storm. It's a culmination of sort of multiple crises, and I see sort of two key narratives that come out of it. We discussed this in a little bit of detail earlier. On the one hand, we have the conservatives saying, oh, well, population, everyday people, you know, they just have to be cold, they have to just wear a jumper, wear gloves at home, because it's really important in the case of Germany that German industry keeps going. We need to use all the gas for the industry because, you know, we have competition against Russia, especially, you know, we need to keep German industry strong, and, you know, the everyday people have to suck it up. And then obviously we have the sort of eco-social side, which says, yeah, we need to make sure that people are safe and they can meet their needs, and that industry should be secondary. So we are, I think that's kind of the two narratives we also see in terms of the climate crisis, right? So whether we sacrifice human beings and the environment for business or not, for whatever reason. But in other ways, I think it also kind of, it takes me back to our paper and the structure agency debate, because it also shows the power structures and path dependency, and especially these socio-technical structures that we built up. And in this case, sort of, yeah, as you also mentioned, these fossil structures, which are increasingly unreliable and are failing as, you know, as provisioning systems of energy. And at the same time, as an individual, especially if you rent your house or your home, you have very little agency in changing that, right? You're reliant on these provisioning systems and these socio-technical systems that provide you with a certain need. And that's, yeah, that's kind of that's a problem. So yeah, it's clear that we need some sort of also deeper structural change and system change, and that's not necessarily something where, yeah, individuals can do something. Of course, maybe if you have your own house, you have a little bit more power, but even then, I think heat pumps, for example, have been sold out for 3 years, right? So yeah, I think that's my 2 cents on that. Pass it on to you, Luca.
Thanks. I mean, that's really not my area of expertise, and I think both comments have already said a lot about this issue. That, you know, the only thing I can maybe add is to say that I think, to me, the crisis is a perfect example of where you end up if you keep postponing certain big environmental issues. I mean, we have been knowing for years that relying on gases and the related long chain provisioning system is really a risky business because long chains, they can be broken much more easily. And we have not taken this seriously. I mean, some cities have done what they could, some private people have done what they could, but as Halliki made the point, I mean, you cannot rely on these islands of transition. You have to act on this, and collectively on a big scale. And that was a huge failure, but I think many people saw it coming for years.
I think many of our provisioning systems are increasingly vulnerable to multiple different forms of crisis. And again, I think it's also just shown how much of our agency we've given away, good and bad, to these socio-technical systems over which we don't have so much power or knowledge, because you need expert technical knowledge, for example. So that's when we talk about provisioning systems, maybe that's also something we need to discuss. And yeah, how reliable or unreliable are provisioning systems that provide us with our basic needs if we have multiple crises.
What I would like maybe to add is also the point of like energy reduction, because I think this is something that has not been up in the discussion so far. So I know it for the last German elections, and actually no party had like energy reduction in their program, which is actually means like one of the most important climate policies you can't even vote for. And I think that's really telling about our political situation, that like it was, politicians were so unaware of the fact that we really need to reduce energy in order to meet climate targets, because we don't manage, like, since we have like overslept all the last years, we are not managing anymore to speed up the renewable energies as long, like in the speed that we needed it. So that is something that is really coming up through the gas crisis now, that we need to reduce energy, and it shows that we are able to, and like how fast actually companies, institutions are able to like just reduce the energy by 20% without changing much, without having much hurt. I think that's kind of an interesting thing. But I also like to like re-emphasize what you said about the trade-off that is there, that about serving households and serving industries. And what I also find interesting, that we're now establishing lists about what are the institutions, the industries, household that should be provided first, and that we have clear lists of obviously on what are essential services and what are not. And I think that's also something that can really help us in the future. What I do miss a little bit on the debate, we have very much have policies on the individual level. So how can households save energy? And then we have this overall targets for the industry. But what about short-term work, for example, in certain kind of industries? So we know that like gas consumption is not equally distributed over all industries. So maybe there's an option actually to reduce working time and scale down certain kind of businesses now, given that crisis, and maybe that might be a nice transition phase for also like an acceleration of the gas sector itself.
Would you maybe like to respond or comment on that? If not,
that sounds good. I would love to see that. I hope that happens. I hope it happens that way. So I think we're also seeing the difference between different countries, right? I mean, in the UK, it's fuck the poor, and basically each man for themselves, and stand in the queue to see the Queen, but you know, then you can die of starvation and the cold. And I think, yeah, in other countries, it's being done differently, but I hope you're right.
Yeah, it's interesting because that goes what happened during the height of the pandemic, right? There's focusing on what are actually essential jobs, essential services, and prioritizing these, and then the potential to do this also in terms of energy use. That's an interesting point. I'll shift gears a little bit. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how the potential for taking an intentionally synergistic approach to climate and social policy is conditioned by by place and scale, right? So in the papers you contributed to the workshop, for example, you all kind of address this in a different way. Like Katharina, you were focusing on the welfare state, so the nation state level, and as you're within Europe. Halliki, you were looking at lifestyles, talking to individuals, and with the foundational economy approach, generally you're looking at communities or more local governments. You each take this approach because you think this is the most effective way, or I would be curious to hear your thoughts on this idea of place and scale and tackling this eco-social policy approach. Whoever would like to go first.
Okay, welcome. Yeah. Well, I think that place and scale are really central in all of this, because we have, and it's actually one of the big material barriers related to this big issue of the multi-level governance. So, you know, we have, as I guess all you know, if you're working on this subject, that, you know, in every country, you know, the scale of social policy changes, and like certain social policies are done and at a certain scale, while others are done at another scale, and in other countries then different. And the same can be said for environmental policies. So there's already an issue of scale within social policies and environmental policies, where sometimes at the local level you might have a coalition of actors who is very much interested of promoting a new kind of social policies, but they don't have the levers, because the levers are at the regional scale, where then maybe there is a government which is not in favor of that kind of social policy. So there's a problem that you have already within social policy, and then the same you could tell for environmental policies. The strategic question to me is, you know, finding pragmatically in certain places the right alignment to actually do stuff. And this requires, yes, knowing what you can do at the local, at the regional, and national level, and create coalitions and able to enact it. So yes, to sum it up, I think, yes, place and scale is a crucial theme in all this debate, which I think at present is more disenabling than enabling the possibility of radical socio-ecological policies because of this splintered political agency. Yes, that would be my point.
Thank you.
Yeah, what I find really interesting about that thing is, so what is actually happening through the, for example, the climate crisis. And I think one thing that is very special is that something is coming back to the welfare state that has not been part of the core of the welfare state in the past. So that is like, feels like housing, food, and transport, for example. These are really things that used to be like something that people should somehow manage to meet when they are like within the welfare state, well insured, have employment, and so on. And now we realize that this starts all like becoming areas in which even middle classes with usual jobs and with like normal participation in the welfare state have struggles of having their needs met. And what is really interesting about that is that these are very much things that are relevant at the local level. So housing, for example, transport is something that's very much linked to the place. So I think, therefore, the regional level, the local level is becoming much more important. But at the same time, I also think that the supranational level is becoming more important. I mean, the welfare state has been a national thing in the past, but with like new climate crisis, for example, this coming up, like flooding and like really catastrophic situations, particularly for small countries, I do see that there's a risk of like welfare state not being able to cope with that anymore. So I see, for example, an increased role of the EU, which is already like taking place. So for example, if we take the Climate Social Fund that is supposed to be part of the new EU activities, I think we do have a mechanism that is kind of has like a social policy approach. So I think we have both. So we're coming away from the welfare state, the national state being the locus of eco-social policies to more a nuanced thing. So the regional level becoming more important, and the EU level becoming more important, which can be I think a chance for like a common EU welfare state, and also for better provisioning at the local level, because in the past I do really see that there was a systematic undervaluation of the local level. So many local services were under provisioned because of the local communities not being well equipped with monetary means. And maybe there's then an interesting collaboration mechanism between the EU on the one hand side and regional and local levels at the other side.
I don't think, actually, I don't think it's climate change that is causing the crisis. I think that's neoliberalism. And I'm not sure if we're coming back to the welfare state for that. I think, or I'm not sure if the welfare state is even helping people meet the needs. Again, I think it depends on which country you're looking at as well. I think actually many people are increasingly not meeting their needs, and I think it's, I mean, certainly maybe climate change plays a role in some of them, but I think a lot of that is actually just going back to the provisioning systems approach. It's just this appropriating provisioning systems, or this rent-seeking provisioning systems, especially in housing, in many places where we have a very inefficient provisioning of housing, because it's the aim of the system is not to meet people's needs, but rather to provide income for the owners of housing, who then seek to receive rents. So I think actually that's kind of a problem, and I would love to see the welfare state come back. But I think in Vienna we're in a very specific situation. I think that's not really happening everywhere. But in terms of eco-social policy in general, I think we're not really seeing it. I would say that, I think there's a lot of very good policies out there being discussed in academia, and I think there is certainly in different pockets there's different things being tried out, but I think there isn't really an eco-social policy agenda as such happening, I would argue. Or I think there's or when there are, it's typically very, very small scale projects done in silos in specific fields, maybe on the regional level. But what we really need actually is we need much more cooperation. For example, in a city government, we would need cooperation between, let's say, like mobility and also, I don't know, maybe the environmental. There's always like one office of the, there's one person who does environmental policy, and then they're separate from everyone else, right? But actually, we need like an environmental person everywhere. So we need roads, or we need new infrastructure to be built already with eco-social policy in mind. Because right now there's like everyone is a little bit how do you call that, like I want to say psychotic, or policy being made is generally psychotic, because on the one hand there's one department that's like, our goal is to build roads, and they just build roads, and then there's this one environmental person who's like, no, don't build roads, but they are instead, you know, trying to plant trees on the roads. But actually it would be great to have some sort of eco-social policy vision where maybe different departments, I'm ranting now, but maybe where different departments would actually work together. And I do think that maybe the local or the regional is in some way an ideal intervention point as an individual or a group. I think that's where we can more easily bring about changes if we get involved. But obviously we need changes on every level. And we need to lobby for changes on every level. Exactly. But overall, I think it would just be nice to have kind of common eco-social policy across the board.
Can you think of some existing examples of either eco-social policies or policies that are ecologically or socially targeted that have the benefits of both that have been implemented?
I can think of, I mean, work-related ones, because that's kind of that was our background. For example, there there's job guarantee trials, especially for the long term. I'm sorry for taking your talking point away from here, but for the long term unemployed, I think in specific, it's always city governments actually that it's rarely implemented on a national level yet, but in specific regions, there's sort of trials of job guarantee projects where they employ long-term unemployed people to do specific social or ecological projects. But again, it's a trial of 15 long-term unemployed people, and then it's celebrated. And there's a lot of reports, and there's like 500 sociologists studying those 15 people. At the same time, there's there's activation policies for the other thousands of unemployed people, which are based on getting people back into jobs and furthering economic growth. So that's kind of what I mean. But there are, of course, for those specific 15 people, there's an eco-social policy.
Luca or Katharina, did you want to?
Well, maybe rather than an example, I would like to point out how to me, in this particular conjuncture, maybe that's not something new, for sure not something new for the people in this room, is the strategic role of housing. Because if you look at the national level in this moment in Europe, I don't see many progressive governments around pushing for socio-ecological policies. However, more at the local level, certainly in cities like Vienna and other also cities around Europe, Barcelona is the other classic example of these years, I see a relatively favorable conjuncture, because you have rather progressive local government, rather progressive civil society and social movements, and also housing is maybe an area where the local level has maintained some control of it. So I think, and here in Vienna, I know that's something taken for granted, but I think that's really a strategic area where, in the relatively short term, I think we could see in certain places in Europe very interesting socio-ecological policies, which could be used as an example to show that actually these things might work.
Yeah, I think I'll reflect something that you brought up during our workshop that I thought was quite a nice way of looking at it. We were talking about connections between different types of provisioning systems, and you referred to habitation more broadly rather than just housing, which I took to be a reflection of the ways in which housing itself ends up connecting to these other provisioning systems and to social and ecological effects in other ways, right? For example, shaping our transit mobility capacities, shaping green space around where we live. So in this way, pointing out as strategic, I think is actually a very nice way of looking at this, as a strategic intervention point.
Yes.
Sorry. Okay, so I mean, I can actually think about a lot of good examples that are being implemented at the moment. So I'm actually quite optimistic about it. So I mean, obviously, the climate dividend or Klimageld, how is it called in different kind of countries? I think that's a really good example. I mean, it's a very simple idea of that we distribute the taxes on CO2 emissions per capita, and actually that's unconditional about something that people do otherwise in their lives. So whether they engage in employment or not, whether do they care work or not. And so this kind of unconditionality that is being implemented, I think this is a really new aspect to welfare services, and I think that's really really motivates me. And then also on the whole mobility thing, I think mobility is really an interesting case, because here we see that it's the consumption area where emissions are most unequally distributed, where we do have lots of policies that are actually eco and social at the same time. So for example, if you think about the German €9 ticket, where people had the opportunity to use all public local transport in whole Germany for only €9 a month, I think that was a really good thing, because it's a very simple policy, it's transparent, and particularly helps those kind of groups which are depending on public transport. And now we have lots of initiatives for more active mobility. So in Austria, there's a new law biking, for example, since a few days, which really supports the rights of bikers. So I think that really shows that this, I think, is an eco-social policy, because who are the people who cannot afford a car? It's mainly people that are less privileged, or people that are, if you think in an intersectional perspective, also particularly like young people, female people, disabled people. They are all people that are depending on good public infrastructure and good active options for active mobility. And the last thing I think is also quite optimistic. I'm quite optimistic about it, is now with the debate on how do we actually like ration the kind of the energy, for example, that we have available, the gas we have available, but also, for example, food stuff that is becoming more critical with the food crisis. We think about it more in terms that every human should have access to certain kind of basic consumption basket, and that this is really necessary for flourishing. I think that's a different kind of logic. So this approach to actually what do people really need in order to survive is getting more important, because in the past we really like put the price risk on people. So if you were poor, you always had to be the risk of things getting more expensive, and that the money that you are depending on is not sufficient for that. And by like reframing that discourse, we actually take some of that price risk. And I think that's really an advance in social policy making.
Just one point though, I think mobility is an excellent example of why it's not just about providing mobility services, but also about banning certain types of private mobility, because in the case of Austria, I think it's like the fastest growing sector, and there's also private mobility emissions are increasing, not just because flying, but also because of the increased size of individual mobility and SUVs and so on. So I think every other sector managed to reduce their CO2 emissions, and actually everything that was won in those other sectors reducing their emissions was cancelled out by the mobility sector growing in its emissions. So I think it's so for me, eco-social policy is not just about providing, but also maybe banning, outlawing harmful emissions. And that's also what we hear back, for example, in our research from citizens, is that we'll say, why should I stop flying when the politicians are flying around, and why shouldn't I fly? And I think that's why it's important also not just to enable people to have sort of sustainable forms of mobility, but also to ban things. Although I'm not sure how we're gonna get people to agree to that.
But I think people actually agree on that already. So I think there was just a recent study that showed that people underestimate how pro-environmental policies people are. So people were asked like, what do you think is the public opinion on that? And they were like 90% of them were off. So they were underestimating the public opinion on that. It really shows like we have this narrative of that, like strong climate policies are not accepted, but they are accepted in fact. But this whole narrative of things not being there, which are actually there, is also like a political illusion that is being made up, because obviously like you can sustain fossil industries more longer if you have this narrative being there that climate policies are not accepted or something like that. And I think particularly like regulation of stuff is a very good thing, because it's very clear, it's like it's valid for everyone, while for example like prices has a problem that they treat people unequally. So when you're rich, you can just like you can buy off that incentive. It doesn't, like, you wouldn't even notice maybe if the prices increase. Obviously this is like the prices idea comes from the industry regulation idea, because in the past we have only tried to find technological solutions. So that's why we're now taking the price idea to the consumer level. But I think actually on the consumer level, this idea of prices, I mean, it's nice, we can still do it, but it will not bring us to where we need. So we actually need better regulation on that, which is also fair, and I think can be quite attractive also.
Thank you. I'd like to open up to our audience now for questions. We have some questions in the chat, and if anyone wants to live ask a question, please just raise your hand, and then you'll be able to do so that way. Otherwise, please do stay muted unless you're actually asking a question. But I'll go first to a question we had in the chat. This is David Barkin, who is writing us from Mexico. And he wrote, the problem with social policy is strongly limited by public sector resources. In the global south, many communities don't consider this a policy issue, but rather a basic social right and communal solidarity principle so that no member gets left behind. Perhaps social right is also a human right. So more of a comment, but if this is something you'd like to reflect on, we'd be happy to hear your thoughts.
I don't have much to say beyond that. I agree entirely.
Yeah, maybe, and I think it's a good, like, also situation to apologize for this very Western view. Like, I mean, my perspective is very Western because I mainly know Western welfare state, so that's why I'm only talking about that. But I think we can actually learn a lot from the global south here, and maybe that's also something Western welfare state should maybe take up more in learning that. But I completely agree that the idea also of social rights is very powerful, because it also gives a social guarantee, and I think that's something that is really dearly needed also to avoid cultural, political conflicts.
Mm-hmm. I think we can definitely also learn a lot about eco-social policies from other countries, where communities are providing already for each other in they're providing for welfare and different needs in much more sustainable ways than we are. So
yeah, that's true. So
yes, on that point, I entirely agree. I must say, I think it's time that high-income countries, especially in the West, start to look at some countries in the global South as actually forerunners. You know, we could ensure welfare and well-being with less resources. I guess many of you have seen the graph, but there's this graph, this classic graph where you have the ecological footprint and the human development index. And I don't want to open up this discussion about the controversies around the human development index. Let's take it as a rough proxy, all right? And but at the end of the day, if I remember right, the only two countries that were near more or less sustainable use of natural resources, and at the same time were meeting human needs to a decent level, are Costa Rica and Cuba. And Vietnam, thanks. Yeah. So
Kerala and India.
Yeah, and then maybe there are even more. So yeah, no. This is please, if you want to bring first, go for it. I mean, my point is done. It's really that we should start to look at those places with a renewed interest.
But I guess it also, again, it has to be not just about just providing this basic floor. I think this has also been said a lot over the past 2 days, but it's not just about having the floor, it's also about having the ceiling, and that's really our problem. And we can no longer put off looking at the ceiling, looking at the over-consuming wealthy people, because we don't have unlimited resources, you know, so.
To provide some context for the listeners, for the discussions we had during the workshop, we talked about this idea of corridors and consumption corridors. I think are fairly well known. They do with the base of the corridors, ensuring everyone has what they need, and the maximum is ensuring that we're not exceeding planetary boundaries. And we'd also discussed in the context of the workshop this idea of labor and production corridors.
You can publish your paper really fast now. It's out there, Richard. So
yeah, there will be a paper in the special issue forthcoming on labor corridors, which we're looking forward to. I'll go to another question from the chat from Jerome Cooney. Jerome asked, should we first decide collectively what is the amount of energy we need for what we would define as our basic needs, or should we start reducing our energy consumption and find out how low we can go and keep a functioning system? The first approach might be more reasonable, but might take much longer to apply.
I mean, there are studies out there that calculate the minimum energy requirement, but obviously very much, it's also the question of in which time frames do we think? Do we think like how much energy will I need in the next week? Or if I plan for that, how much energy will I need in 5 years? If I now plan to use energy then? I think it's very different perspectives. So some things are very changeable in the short run, some are changeable in the long run. And I think we need to do both. So first of all, trying, like experimenting with how much energy do we actually need. I think it's really good because we can learn from these experiments. But I think it's also good to like to do it the other way around, to actually plan how much do we want, how much can we reduce actually energy, and yeah, it's both ways. I think that's good.
But why not try to reduce it as much as you can? I think the only caveat with that is I know someone that did that, and they lived in an unheated attic room the whole winter in Estonia, and they said that they basically just slept for about 20 hours every day because they were just so tired and cold. So you might not be very productive, but maybe that's also good. So you just keep reducing.
So we all just freeze ourselves.
We basically
to reduce our
hibernate. In the winter, we just hibernate. We have many duvets and
Good.
sleep for 20 hours.
Hibernation is the new eco-social policy.
Yeah.
Excellent. So we have another question that brings up a concrete example of the Klima bonus that you mentioned before, or more generally cash payments to everyone. And you addressed this part, but we can still open it up. So do you consider this an effective eco-social policy? Are there better alternatives, for example, free public transport instead? So taking that money and putting it into free public transport rather than these direct cash reimbursements. And how does context matter? Free public transport makes sense in Vienna, but might not help people so much in rural areas considering underdeveloped infrastructures. Go ahead.
Did I answer just
For everyone.
Okay, I would agree with Stefania Barca. Actually, I think the Klima bonus is a good policy as a way of getting public support for climate policies. But I think in general, okay, public services are better than public income, but also, as Stefania Barca says, we actually need a care income. So rather than giving everyone a universal basic income, it's better to target care of those people that are doing unpaid labor for care. So mothers, most of all, because when you give everyone universal basic income, okay, you win in terms of bureaucracy and so on. Maybe not in Austria, very bureaucratic here, but you also increase overconsumption with the people that already have. So in that sense, I think in some ways the eco-social policy, especially if it's funded through a carbon tax, because also it increases public support for different policies to mitigate climate change and so on. But in another way, actually, it's harmful if it increases overconsumption. But this is a typical old. I mean, this debate is already well known and quite old. So care income.
I think care income would be very important, but I don't think it's an either or. I mean, if there's something no lack about it, then it's money in this world. So we do have enough money, and I think the current crisis shows that whenever we want, we'll have enough money for the kind of purpose. At least like in many countries that don't have a problem of like making new debt, and MMT, for example, like it's also still an option. So if there's something no lack of, then it's money. So I don't think it's an either or of like Klimageld or climate dividend and public infrastructure. And I think the good thing about the climate dividend is actually its unconditionality, and that's universal to everyone, and that's actually not tied to any conditions, or not whether you work or you do care work. And I think like paying care work is still another thing. I think that's important, but it should be independent of the climate dividend. And I think as long as we do live in a market economy where we buy specific kinds of products, or where we actually need some money for social participation, there's a good reason why people should also have unconditional income. But obviously they should also have unconditional basic services, or unconditional basic vouchers, as I would argue, but that's obviously could be doing another debate. But I think it's not an either or.
Maybe I'll play devil's advocate a bit here, right? If we're looking at this from an eco-social policy framework, universal basic services or universal public services can be oriented in such a way that they are explicitly driven towards social and ecological ends, right? Structured in this way. These direct payouts, whether it's like a Klima bonus or a UBI, this is much more open-ended. Yeah, this is certainly not in any way necessarily an eco-social policy. So would that play in for you, or am I just pushing my thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, you can fly to Thailand from your Klima bonus, right? So that's already, means that, yeah, it's in some way that's eco-social.
I think that, I mean, you can, like, as it's now also now being done, is that it's actually part of like your income and you have to pay taxes on that. So then it's just a redistribution mechanism actually. And I think what's really interesting about that is that it's unconditional. So I think there's a value in that, as it is unconditional, that is beyond its monetary value. So it makes a difference whether people get that income because they're registered in some kind of like service, for example, they're considered as needy or something like that. So I think because this brings a really different kind of mental infrastructure to the way we think about welfare. And I think that's really crucial actually for solving the crisis, because it might be able to actually change our mental maps about how we should get access to welfare. And that's very like overcoming this growth dependency and the job dependency that people really see might be relevant.
And also that people will actually support policies.
Exactly.
So
yeah,
in that sense, yes, but it should be very small compared to back then, just in case, so that people don't, you know, overconsume.
Luca, did you want to add anything on this?
No, well, I think maybe one general point here. I think we should start explicitly to reward the social and ecological responsible way of being, acting, and trading or whatever, and start to disincentivize strongly not socially responsible and ecological way of being, acting, and so on and so on. It still puzzles me how we still have so much resistance of embracing what is really clear that we have to do. At the same time, I don't think we don't have the resources, because as was said before by my colleagues, we know very well that you know, by taking some of the accumulated wealth of, you know, that's been said so many times, I mean, the resources are there. It's just a matter of taking them and putting in the transition. And again, I entirely agree. It's not just a matter of this or that. I think we should really, again, from a system perspective, the discussion should not be about competing point intervention, like, okay, this incentive here is better, this other intense. This is about recognizing that we have a system right now which systematically does not incentivize social and ecological responsible behaviors, and we need a new system that systematically at different points incentivize social and ecological behaviors. And I entirely agree with what was said. It's not a matter of this policy against this other policy. It's about redesigning a whole system that consistently pushes us towards a certain kind of behaviors which are relevant if you want to still live in this planet.
Like, you mean like, for example, California, where like they're now giving, I think, $1,000, might be wrong, $1,000 to everyone that doesn't have a car in LA, something like that. So you get €1,000 if you don't have a car, €1,000 if you don't fly in a year.
This could be part of the solution,
Okay.
but now we have to recognize that if you have a system in which you have very contradictory incentives, you will not get out of it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you see what I mean? Like,
but this is I mean, this is again this bigger problem, right? What I mentioned also about this one tiny part of a regional government, for example, planting trees, and then the bigger part of the regional government creating new roads. You know, I think there's a whole structural problem that,
I think this is actually a good point for us to sort of wrap it. And I would be happy if each of you would give, no, that's fine. Give a few, maybe just a minute or two as a kind of closing statement, and possibly with some positive forward-looking thoughts if you have them.
Yeah, maybe I can like take up this point and try to like come up with something positive. So I think it's actually absolutely true that currently, particularly through welfare institutions, actually unsustainability is really like incentivized, it's structured, it's actually people are really forced into unsustainability. For example, if we think about the commuting support that is out there, and that is highly problematic, but I think actually it could be done in a very different way. And I think actually the Klimabonus, because it has like kind of like a bad like reputation now, I think it can actually be an interesting tool. So what happened is that about 1 million people didn't receive the money, but they received these vouchers, and I will show it to the people that are online here, because
so who's not Austrian can be jealous.
So
I
what
hope
you
that
can-
no one steals the number of your
I hope so
voucher.
too, yes, so please,
Yes.
it's only valid once, but maybe it's a donation for someone who wants to take it. So what we can see on there is actually like some nice mountains and some flowers, and it's super nice. And I would be really interested in actually what it does to people. So when you give people like you have this like mountains, you may be more inclined to buy products actually that are also good for the environment, because it's like this nice thing, you know, it's like you're really nature-like. And I wonder what that role might be. So if we, for example, provide people with a certain kind of basic baskets which give the right to access environmental goods and services, maybe that might actually change something in the behavior, but we haven't considered that. It hasn't been part of the role of the welfare state to enable people to live, for example, a climate neutral lifestyle. So obviously there's a big resistance against climate policies if people feel left alone. And I think it's very important actually to support people in that. And I think at the moment it's very strange, because on one side we ask people to live climate friendly, but at the same time we disincentivize it, and that must really change. I think it's also a good way of making it visible, like maybe that's very placative, but maybe it's also very clear way of like saying that there's a desired behavior.
Thank you. Halliki, did you wanna?
Yeah, I guess I can actually take it up from where Kathy left off. So in mainstream economics and in general in social psychology, we kind of taught that we're individuals and we're rational actors, and we're taught that it's our fault if we're not sustainable. It's our fault also if we're poor, because we should try harder. And of course, we know that actually we are born into structures and we might have a little bit of agency, but as we explained also in terms of our heating systems or how we live, it's quite difficult to change the structures that we're born into, also socio-technical structures and so on, which might be fossil based. So we need these structural change, and at the same time it's very difficult to bring that about. But in terms of these nature products and encouraging people to buy bio products because they see mountains, again, a part of me wants to say, but why should it be up to someone to decide whether, today I'm going to buy something that kills others, or I'm going to choose to buy something that doesn't. So I feel like I just wish that you can get away from this narrative of personal responsibility in a way, right? Towards structures that allow us to live in ways, not just allow us to live in ways that are in line with long-term sustainability, but also prohibit, there should be a floor and there should be a ceiling, right? We should also be prohibiting things as a society. And I think that starts exactly with changing this narrative about individual choice and responsibility. And that doesn't mean that you can get away from taking responsibility for yourself by saying that it's all about structures. That's, I think, something else, that we need to take responsibility for ourselves and also fight for structural change and new narratives. I think this is where I like what Luca said about strengthening narratives about the good life, which are outside, of overconsumption. Okay, and I could go on and on about this.
But that's a good place to leave it.
I'm going to leave it and pass it on to Kathy.
Yes. Yes, 2 points really beyond what has already been said, which I greatly agree. I think just to reiterate 2 messages which for me are important. The first one is the need for system change, because again, as I said before, if you have contradictory incentives, nothing will happen, and we need that things change pretty fast. So great that we're starting to talk, to have this more engaged discussion on this idea of system of provision, which helps to frame how system change can happen. And then in terms to be positive, again, as I said also at some point, I see really a lot of people, a great shift over the last 10 years after the 2008 crisis, and then the COVID crisis, and then the environmental crisis, I see a great shift of people that are starting to work on transition. And of course, I think to generate the change that's necessary, we need to liberate much more forces. And here, the key blockage to me is the wage employment. If we could really find ways to shorten the working week, we would liberate so much forces to actually work for this new world that we need.
Great, thank you. So thank you, all three of you, very much for your insights and your thoughts and for your time on this evening. It was really nice. And thank you to our audience for joining. I would remind you that we have the second in the webinar series taking place on October 18th. So you're very welcome to join us for that as well. And I hope everyone has a lovely evening or morning or day, depending on where in the world you are.